Welcome to the Hay Festival Book Club. I'm Gary Raymond, your host for this instalment, where I'll be discussing with our guests Sultan in Oman by Jan Morris. It was selected by Sara Wheeler, author of an upcoming biography that marks 100 years since Morris's birth. Copies are available for purchase in the Hay Festival website. A little bit of housekeeping to kick off with. The Hay Festival is a charity with year-round activities to connect audiences with artists. Thank you to everyone for their continued support and engagement. The Hay Festival Book Club is supported by Unwin Charitable Trust, and you can find past events available to rewatch free online now. To our guests then, Sara Wheeler is an award-winning and internationally best-selling travel writer and biographer and a regular broadcaster on BBC Radio. Like Jan Morris, she has spent half her working life on the road. Her 11 books include Terra Incognita, Travels in Antarctica, and Cherry, A Life of Cherry Gerard. Barnaby Rogerson is a writer and joint head of publishing house Elland Books, which works to keep classic travel writing in print, in addition to guidebooks on Morocco, Tunisia, Cyprus, Istanbul and Libya. He has written history books including The Prophet Muhammad, a biography, and his latest work, The House Divided, Sunni, Shia and the Making of the Middle East. He is also a lecturer, television presenter and book reviewer. The format for the book club of this discussion is exactly that, an open and broad discussion about all the matters pertaining to Sultan in Oman. And I will be bringing in questions from the audience throughout our hour. We've had an extremely enthusiastic response to the call out for questions, and there are some great ones waiting for our guests there. It's been a real privilege to revisit this book after such a long time personally, and to do it now with everything that's going on in that region and in the world. So Sara, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first. Could you set up this adventure for us, really, as Morris does so well in chapter 1?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So Morris was a foreign correspondent for the Times in the Middle East, based in Cairo, covering the whole region. And Sultan in Oman was based on one assignment during that period, which was a 6-week journey that Morris made with the Sultan of Muscat and Oman, a wali holy men, and all kinds of other retainers and slaves, Morris called them. We'll come back to their use of that word later. And they were heading into the interior. The function of the journey was to, let's say, pacify some of the independent imams in the interior, who, according to the Sultan bin Taimur, were getting a bit too big for their boots. So the function of this, as I say, of this expedition was to go in, make peace, kind of do a bit of arm flexing, and just make sure that the Sultan's sovereignty was going to be maintained. So they set off in these American trucks. It was about 6 weeks, and one party set off, including Morris and the Sultan, from one end of the route, and another party set off from the other end. And they met in Nizwa, which is that meeting is the emotional focus of the book, when the Sultan and all these people set up a very grand camp in the desert at Nizwa, the ancient capital, and all the various imams and sheiklets came to pay obeisance, but also to show that they sort of had their own agenda too. So Sultan in Oman is the story of that 6-week journey, which took place from the end of 1954 to the beginning of 1955. It's the story of that journey. Morris had published dispatches in the Times along the way, but they were very much based on news, and there was many things she couldn't say. I'd probably say at this point that the Foreign Office were heavily involved in the journey, as they were involved with almost everything in the Middle East. And Morris, like all the foreign correspondents, particularly the Times and the Sunday Times, had her connections with the Foreign Office. They were in on it in a way that was certainly never revealed, and in ways in which it's murky, as everything was then. But they were very much in on it and getting information, because Muscat and Oman was territory that was in a British sphere of influence. And then we're getting into the territory that you alluded to, Gary, and I'm glad you did. British sphere of influence is just the beginnings of oil. Sultan in Oman is a story and a book that shows us so much of the roots of what we're reading about in the papers every day now.
Well, that was one of the reasons why I thought. I mean, you must have picked this book like 2 or 3 days ago, right? It's just it's so relevant and apposite for
It really is.
for the times. It's so eerie that we've come to this book in the book club at this time, but with what's just happened this morning, and I'm sure what will happen between this recording and this going out, there'll be even more being actions being taken and things being revealed. But we will come on to that. Barnaby, obviously travel writing, particularly of this period, the first half to the middle part of the 20th century, juggles many things. It spins many plates, and Jan Morris, of course, globally famous for being extremely good at juggling all those plates. But juggling the plates? No, I don't think that's what she was doing. Spinning those plates, rather. But given what is going on now, and what we probably will discuss about what we can learn from this book as to what's going on in the region at the time, how good an historian is Morris in this book?
It's a good question. I on the back of this, I reread it and I was amazed. It must be now my 8th reading at least. Amazed that even the conversational details, the sort of camp drop lines, are all factual. And I was chasing one story about the forgive for plunging in with my enthusiasm, but in this meeting with the ruling sheikh of Abu Dhabi on the edge of Oman, there's a tall, thin Englishman who's the court poet, and it just caught my attention. And I now realize who it was, but it's just a sort of aside round the campfire, and there is absolute detail. And Jan Morris is totally brilliant in making the story the strong bit. So it just works as a travel narrative because you're not pushing too much information at you, but everything in there is really concise and it's got that sort of, with Sarah and I, that smell of veracity. And I love the detail about it being 6 weeks. You could spend 6 years and get in a terrible mess about Omani politics. And there's something about the freshness of this book and the exhilaration that, allows it all, that journey to bring in so much, to carry it so lightly on her shoulders.
There's something to be said, I think, isn't there, that there was a particular period that I mentioned, early to mid 20th century, where books like this could be written, and it's not just about the fact that we seem to know everything about everywhere nowadays, whereas these places were to a certain audience being discovered for the first time, so you could write in that way about them. Do you think that's fair, that a book about a place like Oman like this couldn't be written nowadays, or wouldn't be?
I think what is so exciting, both as a publisher and a writer, is to realise it was Jan Morris's genius. Because I've been looking, and Sarah now and then helps me try and find good things out there. And since Jan Morris's trip, there's been wars, the Darfur War, there've been all sorts of operations, and there is no narrative to match that engagement that Jan gets from that 6 weeks. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of elegant, well-spoken Arabist, seconded Foreign Office military men who've been involved in the Sultanate of Oman and still are. And I haven't yet, found any of them with this sort of articulate ability to charm and enchant you in the same way. I mean, Sarah did, incidentally, flag out another great book about Muscat and Oman by Ian Skeet, I think because he ended up being a friend of James Jan Morris, but he spent a lot longer there, and it's a more serious sort of historically grounded book, but none of that sort of thin enchantment. You could give someone a copy of Sultan in Oman for any train or flight journey, and they would just be gripped, and they don't need to have been there. They don't actually need to be very interested in the subject before they started. So that's the exceptional genius of this book, I find.
And never any question about the authenticity or veracity that you say of Morris's work in this area, in the same way that somebody like Bruce Chatwin has been called into question and for techniques and but apart from the great storytelling and the innate interest in the region and this new world that was in a way that was being presented, never any question about any narrative shenanigans, shall we say, that perhaps people like Chatwin was accused of.
No, I mean, Sarah will do this better, but literally my ears have been sharpened by just literally reading her biography and realising how factual and how cautious James was, to listen and wait, and extremely well trained in the Times as as a summer intern, subbing, working his way up while going to university. You have a real sense of someone getting their craft skills as an accurate observer, but adding this sort of magic. We'll go into, I hope, later the sources of the books that inspired him, perhaps flavoured some of his wordcraft.
Yes, I think I would add. You mentioned Gary Chatwin, and if I could say, come up with one thing that separates those two writers, it's probably sense of humour. And Sultan in Oman's a very slim book, and it's got everything. To my mind, it's a perfect travel book, and that includes humour. It's got a carry-on flavour, which I think is just wonderful. Do you remember that scene in Nizwa at the ceremonial grand occasion I described? And every time the cannon goes off, a bit of masonry falls down, and nobody takes any notice. And there's Morris trying to walk across the floor with all these sheikhs at the grand moment of ceremonial introductions, and kind of walking in this kind of incredibly
scene, yes,
way. He's obviously taken his shoes off. He didn't want anyone to be able to see that he had holes in the holes in his socks, which would be, to the sheikhs, the most appalling shame. So there's lots of humour in it. There's lots of that granular detail that really makes a travel book work, in my opinion. Like shaving in the only mirror is the wing mirror of the Jeep, and water is bought by the slaves in a goatskin water bag and held there. And so this image of James standing in the desert, shaving in front of the ring mirror of the car, that granular detail. And I might also add, Chatwin did this pretty well too, it's the use of direct speech. It's like yeast, it makes the dough rise. So the history, light touch, the humour, the granular detail, everybody knows what it's like to have to deal with things like cleaning your teeth and shaving. And then the direct speech, not too much of it, that's the key thing. And the way that it does just lift the page. And I would say the whole thing and all those characteristics, plus this sort of threnody for something that's about to die. The romance of the old Arabia was about to be liquidated. That's really what the book's about. And Morris wrote about it overtly, but with a very light touch. All of that wrapped up together, to me, it's like a Greek tragedy. It has a unity. That whole story has a unity. It's not one day like a Greek tragedy, but it has a unity of theme with all those things added together. And I think that if you were to look at, to list all the characteristics of what makes a travel book pretty perfect, this would have it. Just going back to your question, Gary, about was she ever accused of making anything up like Chatwin was in this book? No. It was kind of worse than that, really. She is attacked regularly to this day for being friendly and nice and humorous about the Sultan himself, this little man, Bin Taimur, who was a horrendous monster. he liked to go around saying, the reason you guys lost India was because you educated the people. That's an error. And that was one of his more repeatable pronouncements. He was a vile dictator. And you can go on to, into JSTOR and read lots of learned essays by academics in the field today saying it's a disgrace that Morris portrayed him as, how does she portray him? A funny little guy. And she calls Oman, regrettably, a little paradise by the seaside. Those are valid criticisms. There's no question that he was all of that. Nobody knew quite how bad it was. I know that's the reason everybody brings. I didn't write the book. I'm not defending it from that point of view. But I'm saying we do have to see surely a little bit of context. But if you want to criticize the book, that's the thing to go for, not, and plenty of people do, not the fact that she made it up.
Do you think, from that perspective, that the book could have been written in the way it was if Morris had taken a different perspective on the Oman himself, on the Sultan himself? There seems to be a certain intimacy between them as travelling companions that may not have been quite as possible had. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm playing devil's advocate a little bit there.
Well, if you're saying could she have written the book showing him for what he was, it would have been a different book, and I don't think we'd be here talking about it. And I don't think it wouldn't have achieved anything in terms of a fantastic bit of propaganda that would have got him knocked off his perch, brought democracy in secondary schools and a health system, and made everything fabulous in Oman. Her detractors would say, well, she could have made a tiny step in that direction. Yes, she could. Of course she could. But we certainly wouldn't be here talking about that book now, and nobody would have read it.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Well, I'm interested as well as of putting this book in a context. And Barnaby, you mentioned about talking about some of the books that would have influenced Morris in her writing in travel writing in general, but this book in particular. Could you go a little bit further into that? And then, Sarah, perhaps you could place this book in Morris's oeuvre a little more clearly. How does this book sit in Morris's work?
I think one thing that comes across clearly is this sort of animal excitement and delight that he's doing a travel. And he's sort of bewitched by the Sultan. He's a 27-year-old. If you read Sarah's biography, there's quite a lot of social ambition carefully hidden in Morris's life. And this is it. He really is. It's a secret even from his wife. There's a definite element of Foreign Office. Peter Fleming's involved. Suddenly he is what he wants to be. And he signals that by, in that sort of preface about, although it's just a car journey, I am sort of travelling in the wake of Gertrude Bell and sort of Burton and those are his heroes. Literally, again, proofing, the odd sort of side comments. There's a reference to Fleming in Nizwa, but he camouflages him as just an English colonel. But right from the start, the trip had been planned, and they were, both sides of it. And Fleming had sort of recognised or recommended Morris for it. So you've got all of that, someone steeping himself in purpose into this narrative. What I'm fascinated is that Wilfred Thessinger's book was being created, 45 to about now, but comes out a little bit later than Sultan in Oman. And Thesinger was always furious about Sultan in Oman, just a road trip, but it's much more fluent, much more accessible. And when I was working with Morris to reprint this copy, I said, I hope you don't mind, we're going to use one of Thessinger's photographs. He said, Jan said, I'd be delighted, because he'd be so annoyed. And there was a sort of relish of this engagement between these two Arab travellers. But again, this is all new knowledge weaned from Sarah's biography, but she very carefully points out that Doughty is one of the absolute role models. He also inspired Lawrence of Arabia, that extraordinary sort of mad formulaic sort of what do you call it, Sarah, Spencerian and Chaucerian language floating with a bit of biblical Arabic translation, and that's definitely there. Thankfully, a minor key because it is quite dense stuff. And the other thing I did know about, because Sarah told me years ago, and Morris wrote about it a lot, was his delight in Kinglake's Eothen, and that sort of, as Morris used, the ego biography, making certain that it's a travel, but your delight, your central role as the observer, has got to be totally sort of outed and honest, and those are the flavours which, in my recent rereading, due to Sarah's sort of fantastic biographical research, I kept, summoning up in the text.
Sarah.
Yeah. Before I go on to your question, Gary, let me just say that Thesiger, as Barnaby's indicated, they had a cordial mutual hatred going on. And I very much enjoyed writing all that up. I had access to letters and from both sides, and it was completely hilarious. And then that was one of the things that had to be cut out, because I had to cut so much from the biography. I was determined not to have this great tome. So none of it's in there. But I'm hoping someday somebody will ask me to write a series of essays of people who were cut out. Thesiger's one of them. So, right, Gary has asked me to put this book, Sultan in Oman, in context, which I'm delighted to do. Well, first of all, let's say that Morris wrote 58 books. Yes, you heard that right. That's too many, by the way. Some of those were anthologies. An interesting thing about the 58th is it was published posthumously, which was her plan. She wanted to control the story, the narrative of her life, even when she was dead. So she planned a posthumous book and made a posthumous promotional film that would go out posthumously. That gives you an idea of how much she's crafting this narrative. Anyway, Sultan in Oman comes really near the beginning, before we've even reached double figures. There are the first book she ever wrote, which came out in 1956, is Coast to Coast, about a trip, about a year she spent in America as a Commonwealth Fellow with her family with her. And after that, it is the 3 Middle East books, which in my opinion are not nearly enough known. And this one, Sultan in Oman, was the last one to come out, came out in 1957. What are the other two? They're all of a piece in my mind, these 3 Middle East books. What are the other two? One is a slim volume, which is a portrait of the Hashemite monarchy, which was the puppet kings that the British had set up as part of this effort we've alluded to already of keeping their hegemony up in the region. They set up this monarchy. And when Morris was a foreign correspondent, she knew all the representatives, all the monarchs. She went to Faisal's wedding, so she wrote this book that's called The Hashemite Kings. It's a slim volume, which is a story of that tragic monarchy, really relevant today because it shows Britain trying to remake the Middle East in its own image by making up invented countries like Transjordan and so on. The ramifications has led to where we are now. The third book is, I think, really wonderful. It's called The Market of Seleucia. That title, I'm very pleased to say, comes from a Cavafy poem. I'm very keen on Cavafy, and I was pleased that Jana picked it. What is it? It's a portrait of the region done country by country. It's quite a long book, The Market of Seleucia, and it's absolutely fascinating for the reasons we've said. It shows so much about, her first visit to Kuwait, for example, as a foreign correspondent, and the first oil men have just landed. American oil men have landed on their planes. There's no airport, runways, but they make runways on sand, and they come down the makeshift steps. These oil men with golf bags over their shoulders. There's no golf courses in the whole Middle East. Very quickly, they start making golf courses out of the sand. paying obeisance to the emir of Kuwait. He wasn't an emir quite yet, actually, but he became one on independence. It was just a kind of head shake at that point, and saying to the sheikh, "We would like to start drilling in this one place. Here it is on a map. I hope that's okay with you. And if you'd like to look out that window there, you'll see a yacht. That's yours now." And then the sheikh goes down and gets on it. "He's got a yacht." And he said, "Where am I going to put the sheep?" So they built a sheep pen on the top deck. I'm not saying that to apply some sort of primitivism to the sheikh of Kuwait at the time. I'm telling you that story because this is the clash of values, and that's what everything was all about. And Morris says, really, in all those three books, she says, the transition, what is that? I've got the quote here. "The transition between values was hideous to watch. Oil was liquidating the romance of the old Arabia." And actually, that's me who said that. All of that was starting. And what you said, Gary, about books being written at the time, the romance of the old Arabia, the proud, craggy Arab standing in the desert looking forward. There's a lot of truth in it all, there's a lot of romance in it all, but this was the end of it. It was no longer going to be possible for that romance about sort of, Lawrence of Arabia, tea, and all the rest of them. A lot of all that was a load of tosh. And Morris, like me, thinks that T. Lawrence was a pretty rubbish writer, by the way, and that Seven Pillars of Wisdom is almost unreadable. That's another story. But so in the context, I come back to the question finally. So the context is these three Middle East books. Morris never really came back to writing about the Middle East. While all this was going on, of course, Everest had happened. It's quite characteristic of Morris's life that all of this is going on. All of this, the first books, the new books, the fame, the being there at the right time when the Middle East, since the Ottoman Empire, a cause of huge anxiety that for all the Western allies that the Soviets were going to come in. She was at the heart of it all. But whilst all that was going on, she'd been up Everest and brought the news home in time for the Queen's coronation and became overnight the most famous journalist in the world while all this was going on. That was in 1953, as you know. So it's perhaps no surprise that in the context of those 58 books, there's no real sustained concentration for a long time on the Middle East anymore. And that's because there was just so many other fabulous things for Morris to do and be in the heart of all of them. But the whole issue of crumbling empires and the whole issue of change and geopolitical axial turns, that was something that was in her first book, The Rise of the American Hegemony, Rise of the American Empire, to her last one. Notably, of course, the Pax Britannica trilogy about the British Empire, which Morris always said was a centrepiece of her life. So whilst in the context of the Morris oeuvre, the Middle East never crops up in a sustained way like it does in these three, I think, very important books at the beginning, the central theme really carries on through everything she ever wrote. And I think what she saw happening in the Middle East had a decisive influence on her analysis and portrait of the British Empire, which are much more well known in terms of the context of, Pax Britannica.
Well, Barnaby, let's get down to it then. In terms of what we're seeing on the news and what now, I was listening to the radio on the way in, what is now about to hit inflation and mortgage rates and all these things. What is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, for example, right now? What are we reading in this book that relates to what is happening today?
I mean, Oman is fascinating because until you've gone there, you think of it as part of the Arabian Peninsula. But when you're there, you immediately realize that this is also equally part of the Indian Ocean. And you have that sort of maritime connection in Oman. And you have, the Sultan that Jan Morris travels with had not deposed his own father, but his father had been encouraged to resign because he's bankrupt. And where does he go home to retire to? He retires to Bombay and is living there till 1965. There's those Indian Ocean connections, and the fact that there were bits of Oman. Zanzibar used to be part of Oman. There were trading ports on the Persian and on what is now the Persian-Iranian coast, and the Pakistani coast is absolutely fascinating. There are strong elements of old Indian trading Muslim communities in Oman that then became their own sort of tribe to protect themselves within Omani identity. There's Baluch soldiers serving in the Omani army. You've got that sort of wonderful bedazzling and still, to my mind, fascinating. I don't think the romance of Arabia and the Middle East is dead at all. I think it's as live as ever. Oman I love because it's always known that it's outside of the main Central Arabian Empire project, and that their loyalties are scattered all over the world. They've got connections with Malaysia, with India, and they are very good at talking to the Iranians alongside the Qataris and being a sort of natural middle ground, because quite rightly, Maurice doesn't go into the area that I'm really interested in. Sultan Oman is the Imam who's leading the rebellion, is actually representing a lost form of early Islam, the Ibadi movement. And Maurice realizes this is too much on your first read. But that puts Oman aside from the Sunni Shia schism that normally, sets Saudi Arabia against Iran going. So Oman has got its own spiritual integrity, its own internationalism. This is, opening windows into many things, but Oman is not nothing. It's got actually a terribly rich, fascinating international heritage, and it could yet, with Qatar, emerge as a peacekeeper. They've got their very own active navy. I mean, what one yearns for is more self-policing of these waters, and Oman sort of perhaps ready for that role.
So Oman could become a vital, play a vital role in sorting out the situation.
But they are a middle ground. They, and the other side of Sultan Oman journey was the Saudi were backing Wahhabi tribes and clans in Oman, possibly for takeover of the whole of the Sultanate of Muscat and Oman, at the same time that Nasser was intriguing with proto-Arab nationalists. So I'm probably the last standing apologist for the tough old tyrannical sultan that Jan falls in love with as a friend, as a travelling companion for 6 weeks, because he had some really bad cards stacked against him. His country was bankrupt. Before oil came, there was no way of modernising it. There just wasn't any cash there. He had the Saudis snapping at him. He had the Ibadi community, which he was part of, but had to keep under some sort of control. He had all this sort of Indian Ocean heritage of a once great trading empire, and the forbidden word of slavery, because Zanzibar and the East African trade wasn't all about slavery, but it was certainly, that was a big part of it.
Sarah, was it a slightly curious decision on the part of the Sultan to allow Maurice on that journey alongside, or is it quite clear that it was a sort of inviting in of the Western eye?
I won't say it was curious, but it was unprecedented. And it was, the whole thing was brokered by one of the top guys at the Times, who was married to somebody or other to do with in the Middle East, and they were able to tell bin Taimur that British support would be increased and strengthened for him if he allowed two reporters from the Times to, and it was all kind of purveyed in a way that made it clear that bin Taimur was among friends, having the Times there, and the fact that it was in British sphere of influence, and the British had huge motives for keeping him sweet, that was very, very clear to him. So he was confident. He didn't really know what damage they could have done. because they could have done a lot of damage to him and his reputation. But there was no way the Times were going to do that, because the Times was hand in glove with the Foreign Office, and they were all desperate to keep everything under good relations with the Sultan because of the sphere of influence and because of his role in the region. For example, I mentioned earlier slaves. They were slaves. And in his dispatches to the Times newspaper, so this is long before the book, he said so. And the Foreign Office, who got to see everything that the Times published before it went in, if it was insensitive, said, we have to take slaves out, we not call them slaves, because it's our sphere of influence. It's a kind of protectorate, and we don't have anything to do with slaves, do we? If you've only have heard anything more hypocritical than that in your life, I'd like to hear it, but that's the way people carried on then. So the Times indeed took the word slaves out of all their dispatches. So when Sultan and Oman comes out, that was Morris's chance to put it back in again. She was really annoyed at being censored. And there's a very funny scene in Sultan of Oman at the end when the trestle tables come out after the ceremony is all over at Nizwa. And she's sitting at her typewriter, Peter Fleming's sitting at his, and the official guy, who's a British guy, who's representing British interests and lives there, is also there. Morris finishes a dispatch, and she says very sweetly to this Foreign Office official, oh, you can read this before I send it if you like. And he said, actually, everything has to be shown to me before you send it anyway. So, of course, he was completely furious about that. But the Times and the Foreign Office were in total control of everything that was purveyed to the British public. So nothing nasty like association with slavery was going to get out there. Great opportunity then when the book came out 3 years later. She said, I'm going to put slaves back in. And she did. And she said, because they were slaves and should be called as such.
The perfect opportunity there, because I haven't yet brought in any questions from audience members. And all of a sudden the hour's going to be up because it's just too much of a fascinating conversation. I won't have done it, but that's a good opportunity to bring in a question about language from a slightly different perspective. Owen has asked, and perhaps you could both take this in turn because you'll have slightly different perspectives on it perhaps. How should modern readers approach outdated or problematic language in older travel writing? I mean, that's a bit of a hot topic question of recent years, isn't it? Barnaby, perhaps as an editor, first you could talk about how you deal with that sort of subject.
So far, we've never yet edited language out that has now become offensive. And I did ask some colleagues, amongst other classic publishers, and they said they don't want to do that either, but they want to warn a reader in advance that they might come across language they find offensive. And I think that is what, there's a book I'm looking at the moment, I can't tell you what it is, but I want to publish it. I don't want to cleanse it, because I think we need to remind ourselves how far we've advanced sometimes, and things are on some levels better in the world. And I think, but a nice publisher's note, page 32, you will find language or a scene that is deeply offensive, but is perhaps the way we're going to go forward. But that's particular for us because we are just literally reprinting books and we don't want to interfere. We've only ever edited books when they got really boring about Roman coins and, sort of taking some language out because it's just sort of, that was the 19th century. They wanted to hear about, Alexander the Great's colonists. That we've allowed ourselves, but I'd be very, very wary of missing out how much we've advanced. And what about you, Sarah?
Yeah, Sarah, the idea that the pretending that books weren't written with that language or views like that weren't held in the past seems a very peculiar idea to me. But how do you think readers should approach books that have what is now problematic? I mean, was always problematic, but in the context of now is problematic language.
I think that Owen's question is a very good one. The obvious answer is context, making it your business to have an idea of context. And in terms of reissuing books, a new introduction can go a long way to sets, for example, in this book, one could say something about what exactly it was like in the kingdom and how everybody was poor. And had there been social indices then, Muscat then, judging by the time, not now, Muscat and Oman would have bumped along the bottom of all of them. And the Sultan didn't need to keep them like that. So in terms of his status as a very malign dictator, in terms of his people, it's good to know that, and it's good to know, instructive to know, that the Foreign Office thought it was totally okay to support somebody like that and supply them with whatever they wanted and so on. So I think an acknowledgement of context is the way forward for a reader. I always try and make sure I'm approaching a book. I'm a generalist, not a specialist. So I don't know anything about anywhere. So I have to start again each time trying to get some idea of context. And I find it helpful. It seems to me, just to finish off on Owen's point, that the answer is not to silence the past. The past continues to speak in the present, and I think we ignore it at our peril. And actually, it's very useful to see how British arrogance and complacence in the Middle East in the 1950s, setting up of a monarchy for one thing. I think it's okay to go and set up a monarchy in a foreign land. Yeah, that was fine then. How that's played out. And one would like to think maybe it had some bearing on foreign policy today, but that is a hopelessly optimistic view. But it is a writer's duty to have hope.
Well, yeah, that's very true. About the perspective of Morris in this book, one of the things I found most interesting and fascinating was going back and reading the book as a middle-aged man rather than a young man the first time I encountered it, and being more aware of Morris as a sort of a representative of Westernism. I don't know why I'm more aware of it now. The world has changed, I suppose. Do you think that, again, going back to a question from very early on in our discussion, whether books can be written that way anymore? There's such sensitivity in writers about other cultures that regarding them in any way other than positive or neutral maybe could be something that has sort of been eroded away, or I don't want to use the word self-censored or anything, but it's sort of been eroded away over time. Whereas Morris in this book is very much a member of the British establishment, for want of a better word, and uses terms like medieval and primitive in terms of looking at the culture. When in fact, Sarah, as you said, it's a clash of cultures and a clash of ideas rather than what from a Western perspective might look like a clash between modernity and primitivism, I suppose.
I think it's still the writer's duty, Gary, to observe and to bring those messages to people interested enough to read about them, then as now. We just do it in different ways. We've learned a lot, I hope, about sensitivity, how to approach it. But clashes of cultures are as relevant now and as useful to understand. I just came back yesterday from Paraguay, where I was for a few weeks, and gripping beyond belief, in a country very much in the middle of lots of powerful neighbours and doesn't get much attention from the foreign community. And I think there's an awful lot can be said by an outside observer. Of course, it'd be better if the Paraguayans wrote it all themselves. It'd be better if there were no travel writers like me writing anything at all, and that every indigenous person in every place wrote their own books. Okay, let's really work hard to promote education and make sure that happens. In the meantime, we're allowed to go and observe, and people will judge us on whether we bring our own sensibilities to bear or our own prejudice to bear. Writers must be judged by that, as they always have been. But I believe, in the same way that since the Odyssey, people have been saying everyone's been everywhere now, travel writing is dead. They have been saying that since the Odyssey.
Well, I'm glad that I'm fitting into a noble tradition of saying that myself.
It's just not true. We can go and observe the other bring the news back and we can all think about it. And of course, it's my hope and wish that that is all to the furtherance of understanding. And God knows, understanding and having empathy with the other is of more critical importance now than it has been since way before the Odyssey.
Barnaby, were you going to say something?
Well, I would just, like you, I've reread this book many times, and one's aware of different sort of takes as your age comes. And you use the word medieval, and then been sharpened by reading Sarah's biography. And I was aware for the first time that James and his two brothers were educated, because the mother was desperate for them to continue their musical education but couldn't afford it, by going as choristers to medieval abbeys and singing. They never had Christmas at home because they were performing as choir boys, not exactly slaves, but definitely placed in really odd communities dominated by old men talking of theology and whatever. And sometimes you just get James's sort of excitement that he's been trained, oddly enough, in this mad world. He had to get on with rural and urban deans, as a young boy, and receive odd wax presents after Christmas because he wasn't spending it with his mum at home. And you think he's actually got this perfect ear for these other cultures. And again, reading Sultan Oman, I was amazed and impressed how the English companions are often rather trashed, and the fun jokes are with Omanis. And there isn't, well, it wasn't in my rereading last night, any judgment of which community was better, more funnier, better looking, and I think he still comes across as really sort of relevant and untainted.
Well, in that regard, if we take a sort of wider lens now, pull back from the book a little bit, Sarah, just how, I mean, we can all discuss how important and relevant Morris remains, but just how influential has Morris been on travel writing, but non-fiction writing as well? I mean, obviously, both of you can explain this far better than I can, but the evolution of travel writing into narrative non-fiction and using novelistic tools over the 20th century and beyond has been phenomenal and one of the most exciting areas of all literature, I think, watching that evolution. But what role has Morris played in that? Perhaps, Sarah, if you'd like to take that one first.
Well, hugely influential. If you went round doing a vox pop of people who are readers but not in the writing industry and get them to come up with the names of travel writers, it'd be Paul Theroux and her, wouldn't it? I should think the first two would be. So hugely influential. I've been working on this biography for 3 or 4 years, and so I've come across a lot of people who aren't in the literary industry, but who have spoken about, oh yes, I read Venice, it made a big impact on me. Yes, I took Venice with me. This is her book, Venice, published in 1960. When I went to Venice, I took her book with me, and it was like seeing Venice open like a flower, somebody said. So hugely influential. But I want to say something in response to your question, Gary, which is what interests me about the whole notion of travel writing and her place in it, is that, like Chatwin, who you've mentioned, she hated being called a travel writer. It was her life's battle not to be called a travel writer. And so was Chatwin's. When one of Chatwin's books was submitted for the Thomas Cook Travel Book of the Year award, he pompously insisted it was withdrawn. They didn't want to be called travel writers. Why? I believe it's because they perceive travel writing to be a lesser form in the hierarchy. Most writers, consciously or subconsciously, think of writing as a hierarchy. Poetry's at the top. That's in such rarefied air, we needn't bother about that. Fiction comes next, and non-fiction's below it. And in non-fiction, travel writing's right at the very bottom. It's not as important enough. The really serious people don't write travel writing. That's what Morris and Chatwin and a whole range of other people thought. Absolutely not my view in any way. But it's interesting to me that they held it. And they all, talking about the travel writers generation above me, we've mentioned quite a few names, they all wrote novels on the side. Because of that, I believe, because they thought it was a higher form, and proper writers, the ones who are still at it, they still are writing novels on the side. They think that a proper writer is a fiction writer. I probably think that fiction's a higher form, but that doesn't mean I've got to do it. And I had made an arrangement with my agent many decades ago that he would shoot me with his small pistol if ever he heard me come in and say, you know what I'm going to do next? I'm going to write a novel. But anyway, it's an interesting thing, a sideline, but you can see it's great interest to me, this hierarchy. And that she would always say, I'm not a travel writer. She would tick people off if they introduced her, Jan Morris, travel writer. I'm not a travel writer. She would tick them off. Many people reported that to me. She said so in print. And I think that I completely disagree with all those people's perceptions that travel writing is a lower form.
You bring up a really interesting thought, though, isn't it? That because of those writers that you named and many others viewed travel writing as a lower form, and so they all wrote and aspired to writing fiction and great fiction, that you see bleeding into their travel writing the tools of fiction, like you say, about the use of dialogue and the use of an adherence to narrative structure. And so they inadvertently, I mean, I don't agree with it either. I agree with you, Sarah, but they inadvertently, if you want to think of it this way, heightened the form of travel writing by their insecurities and prejudice against it.
Yes, they absolutely did. You use the phrase "they're great fiction." They wanted to write great fiction. None of them did. They wrote fiction. None of them wrote great fiction. And they couldn't seem to see it, which is something else I think about quite a lot. But you're right, a lot of the same tools. We've mentioned dialogues, metaphors. I mean, it's writing. It's writing. Then you've got the structure, which takes the place of plot. And I think you're quite right, actually, Gary. I've never thought of it quite like that. Inadvertently, they raised the genre. Although there was plenty of people around since, well, we mentioned Eothen, Alexander Kinglake's Eothen. Terrible title. I mean, you can hardly even say it, but it's a portrait of the Middle East. And Kinglake was the first person who really made it personal and funny, his story. It's a brilliant book. And one could cite a few others that came after him. Alexander Kinglake's Eothen, which was Jan Morris's role model forever, all through the decades. And when she was asked often what was her favourite travel book, she was often asked that, as we all are. And she often said, often cited Kinglake. So yes, just to finish off that, it is all the same tools. How could it not be? It's writing. And the best lyrical passages in some of the greatest travel writers, you could even say, it's the same as what's poetry? What's the difference between poetry and prose? Well, poetry communicates before it's understood, doesn't it? Because it's compressed in a really good sentence from Jan Morris or Eothen, or one could mention some others. That's what happens. It's communicating before it's understood, because there's that amount of compression and what's the word I'm looking for? The opposite of dilution, concentration. That's it. So yeah, I think you're right.
Barnaby, the same question in a way, but as publisher at Elland, you must see Morris's fingers through so many books that have come after and during her career.
We were contaminated by Jan's charm. Both my wife and I, we run this company together. It's a cottage industry and a garret. And before we acquired Eland, before I set up Sickle Moon Books, I sent a sort of fax to her, and I was just looking at it this morning in our files, and it is just so charming a response. She couldn't have known who I was, and she was enthusiastic, energetic, funny. She was just said, "Forgive me, I've just come back from Trieste. I've lost my luggage in Frankfurt," and then she bumped into my wife, attending one of her lectures in the RGS. We were sort of young, unemployable people in London. And, my God, she was up for it and game and fascinated. And again, one of the, we love her, him in every way. I was obsessed by her Venetian Empire, not the best book I know that she did, but that set me off as a young man writing guidebooks to Cyprus and other things. I was fascinated, again, in this recent biography, to find out that Sarah was talking about poetry skill, about condensing. I think a really good travel book condenses history, anthropology, archaeology, maritime trade statistics into something funny, into a good paragraph. And I was fascinated in Sara Wheeler's biography of Jan Morris that Macmillan, Prime Minister of Britain, bored to tears with Foreign Office reports, reads the Sultan of Oman overnight, like me last night, and orders, mind you, he was a publisher from a publishing family, he orders 12 copies in the morning, sends them to all of the chief of the defence staff and the important ministers and said, read that before the next cabinet meeting when we're talking about Arabia. And that's the power of it. And we've heard that, that's happened several times about how a travel book in the end can change and shift patterns. And it is a form of, in the right hands, a form of exquisite generosity of using your skills to tell other people's stories that have not yet been published or told.
Well, that brings us very neatly to the last question, and the last question from an audience member as well. This is from Sarah. For people who have enjoyed reading this, what else would you recommend? Sarah?
Well, I think probably I'd have to recommend another very slim volume by Morris, which is set in the same period and is slightly, in many ways, the same style, which is Coronation Everest, which is the story of Morris, who was the embedded, as the word would use now, it didn't exist then, the embedded Times journalist and the only one who had exclusive access to the team that went up Everest to see if they could conquer it in 1953, and had to get the message down in time for the Queen's coronation. It's not about the climb. All the climbers wrote those books. It's about getting the message down, and it's hilariously funny. It had to come down in code, the message, because whilst Morris had the exclusive, every newspaper in the universe had their man, they were all men, there on the mountain, hiding behind a glacier, ready to hit the Sherpas over the head or give them a used fiver to get the message in their pocket and steal it and get... They were there doing that. And so they had to be in code, so the messages would be... So the working out of all the codes, and then at the last, there was a radio operator a certain way down who powered the radio by a stationary bicycle. And he could send messages to Kathmandu where they could go to the British Embassy. They had to be in code too, but the guy at the British Embassy, but the radio operator wouldn't send messages in code, so it had to be a code that didn't look like a code. And so it went on, one long scream of anxiety. And I won't say any more about it, but Jan Morris did it, and the morning of the Queen's coronation. So it's a great, fun and amazing epic story, the narrative, but it also has this same message. Why was it so important that Britons, Kiwis were Britons for the purposes of this, should be on the top of the mountain, because it represented what Britain was. But as Morris knew, that was the last gasp. They were still clinging on to it. We've got the right, we've got this, we've got that, we're at the head of it. Don't forget, India had gone 5 years before. It was another last gasp. And the papers all spewed out about a new Elizabethan age, with this young queen on the throne, all this and Everest too, and all the rest of it. But the book sounds a klaxon, just like Sultan in Oman does, a klaxon. Something is about to change. We can't go on like this. Both books could be called We Can't Go On Like This. So I think I'd recommend Coronation Everest.
Fantastic. Barnaby, what about you?
Oh, I'm going to I'm going to agree, just because of my obsessive interest in this part of the world, is the book that Sara Wheeler brought to us, was Ian Skeet, who shared a dahabeeyah with his family in Cairo with the Morrises, then went on to write Muscat and Oman. And for me, it's a companion piece, separated by, no more than 5 years, but the oil is flowing now. And there are options in Muscat and Oman. And having had that wonderful, galloping, wonderful, romantic, and Morris is just such a romantic in the end. You're just carried along with, the flags are always flying, aren't they? The red flags of Muscat and all the forts when he's travelling. And then with Ian Skeet, you get a more detail.
Well, fantastic recommendation. And what a discussion. If that doesn't make anybody watching or listening go away and want to read Sarah's new biography, of course, but also Sultan in Oman, then I don't know what to say to you. I really don't, because I'm totally won over. But that's it from this instalment of the Hay Festival Book Club. Many thanks to Sara Wheeler and Barnaby Rogerson for your brilliant insights into this book. Thanks to the Hay Festival for inviting me to host this particular edition. It's been great. And thanks to our audience for the excellent questions. Sorry we couldn't get through many of them, but we got a few in there. The Hay Festival Book Club will be back next month with another gripping title. Follow the book club's new Instagram page at Hay Festival Book Club to hear first what that title will be. Until then, goodbye.